Hello everyone, this is Stephen Nojiri, and this audio is to introduce to you the Charter for Ethical and Responsible Research of Samurai Culture, Cerrsc for short. Now, currently the charter only exists in a preliminary version, and the link to the preliminary version is in the description below. So you should go ahead and click that link and get the PDF of the preliminary version. Now, again, it's only in its preliminary stage because there's a few more steps before the final version of the charter comes out. The final version of the charter needs to be approved by several other people. It needs to be networked a little bit more. Right now, again, it's in its infancy stage. It hasn't been thoroughly spread and approved by enough people in order for it, in other words, we need more input, and it will change and adapt somewhat, maybe a little, maybe a lot, over before the final version comes out. However, the core intention of the Charter for the Ethical and Responsible Research of Samurai Culture is present. So I'm going to make this video to discuss it because, again, even though the charter will adapt and change a little bit for the final version, the essence is already here. So, the Charter for Ethical and Responsible Research of Samurai Culture has been drafted in order to hopefully, create a collective change in how samurai culture is researched and presented mostly in the Western world, but also in the Eastern world as well too, because it's not just in the West that there are some unethical and some irresponsible behaviors taking place. The ethical and responsible research of samurai culture, the charter is based on academia, but it is not meant to solely refer to just academics. It's meant to be an all-inclusive collective approach to how to conduct ethical and responsible research of samurai culture. Whether you are a martial arts instructor or a university professor, the point is all of the people involved have some measure of investment in samurai culture, some greater than others, and there needs to be a collective agreement, a collective understanding of what are the ethics and what is responsible behavior in this process. Right now, there doesn't appear to be any sort of collective. You have the academics, such as myself. We follow the academic guidelines of ethics and morals and responsible research, et cetera, et cetera. But we do that because we are the academics. So at this point, there seems to be there's no, everything's disjointed. Every different group has its different way of what it perceives as ethics or what it perceives of its responsibilities. So this charter this charter's purpose is to try to make an overarching collective understanding of ethics and responsibility. And it doesn't go as you'll read. So the PDF is in the link description. So the first thing that you need to do is click on the link in the description and get to the PDF so that you can have access to the preliminary version. So do that first. I will go over the main charter and I will touch on the appendices, but I will not go word for word to the appendices. And then you can see the essence of this charter is to bring everybody together collectively, to give everybody, a solid voice in the collective, but with guidelines. Right? So the purpose, so now I'll go ahead and just read the main text, which is the actual charter, and then I will go over it some, and then we'll go over the appendices a little bit, and there's a little bit more to say at the end. So the Charter for Ethical and Responsible Research for Samurai Culture, Cerrsc for short. The purpose of Cerrsc is to produce and maintain a set of working guidelines to which produced works of samurai research can be measured against to determine the work's levels of ethical and responsible treatment of samurai culture. So let's just look at that. That's the purpose statement. So let's examine that for a moment. The purpose of Cerrsc is to produce and maintain a set of working guidelines. That's pretty straightforward. In other words, this charter lays out the guidelines, the core principles, to which produced works of samurai research can be measured against. So produced works of samurai research you'll see in Appendix 5 works refers to, or produced works refers to, productions involving the results of research in samurai culture. So basically anything that can be of various mediums, but the most common medium is written work, audio recordings, film, video, etc., etc., etc. So when anybody produces a work, when anybody makes a book, an article, a video about samurai culture, that produced work can be measured against the Cerrsc guidelines to determine, and then the next part, to determine the work's level of ethical and responsible treatment of samurai culture. So that's pretty straightforward. Cerrsc exists in order to provide some measure of ethical and responsible regulation to produced works. So let's look. So you'll see that this is broken into ethical and responsible. So these are the true main parts of this charter: ethical and responsible. So I'll read through them and go and discuss them a little. Ethical: that the work does not contain outright fabrications, that the work does not fail to take into account cross-reference materials and the work of other ethical and responsible works, that the work is free of malice and ill intent towards any particular group or group of persons, that the work does not seek to degrade nor disempower legitimate invested samurai descendants, that the work does not seek to empower non-samurai descendants to positions of supremacy over invested samurai descendants, that the work does not exist for the purpose of providing false legitimation to organizations who cannot establish legitimation through ethical and responsible means, that the purpose of the work is to establish ethical and responsible histories and records of samurai culture without further agenda other than to establish an accurate and ethical record of history in accordance with the standards of the involved disciplines. So let's go through that. That the work does not contain outright fabrications. In other words, it's unethical to lie. It's unethical to fabricate data. So there we go. No data fabrication. That the work does not fail to take into account cross-reference materials and the work of other ethical and responsible works. In other words, no longer should we operate in bubbles and not cross-reference our work with other people, other responsible researchers who are investigating the same or similar topics. We should be cross-referencing, we should be networking, we should be communicating. That the work is free of malice and ill intent towards any particular group of person or groups of persons. There are many people who produce a lot of work currently for the purpose of hatefulness towards other groups. There's a lot of infighting that's hiding behind the mask of research, and that's unethical. That the work does not seek to degrade or disempower legitimate invested samurai descendants. So look at Appendix V, and you will see that the word invested samurai descendant refers to families which descend from samurai who have some measure, cultural and or economic, of investment in the history of their family and their family's ancestors. And the further definition, measure of investment, carries with it the understanding that an author's work, if that work is disempowering, may cause significant loss to the family's finances and or social standing. This particular aspect comes from the fact that in proper ethical research, you cannot harm the subjects of study. And since legitimate samurai descendants, invested samurai descendants, meaning that they have something to lose from your unethical research. So that's what you need to understand. If your research is ethical, it does not harm them. But if your research is unethical, it could potentially harm or disempower legitimate samurai descendants. This is a key point because the samurai descendants are the samurai of the present time. Those are the family members of the people you're studying. They are the current incarnation of the group. You cannot harm them. Your research cannot seek to harm them. You'll see in one of the appendices, there is a discussion of its potential for your research. Your legitimate ethical research might cause problems, but there is a very distinct way to discuss this. And we'll go over that when we go through the appendice that addresses that. But in general, your work cannot seek, it cannot start, it cannot have the intention of disempowering or degrading legitimate invested samurai descendants. And again, that comes from the very fundamental field research ethic, moral rule that you cannot harm your research subjects. And then we say that the work does not seek to empower non samurai descendants to positions of supremacy over invested samurai descendants. This also comes from field research rules and ethics where you cannot, your research cannot exist for the purpose of disempowering the subjects. In the early 1900s, there was a lot of field research that was done for the purpose of suppressing or proving superiority of a particular group over another group. And that was harmful and that was degrading to the group being studied. And that is found to be unethical and immoral. So the same principle applies here. You cannot do, we agree that we will not do work for the purpose of suppressing legitimate groups while trying to raise other groups up and over them. Now, the next line, the work does not exist for the purpose of providing false legitimation to organizations. There is a lot of work that exists currently that is being put out. Most of it is by non-academics that doesn't really seek to create a accurate and ethical history and cultural record of the samurai, but seeks solely to legitimate false organizations that have illegitimate claims to that history. So that is unethical because they are manipulating the history for self benefit and not even for and how do I say it? They're putting legitimate history at risk for their own selfish purposes. So that's unethical. That the purpose of the work is to establish ethical and responsible histories and records of samurai culture. There, without further agenda other than to establish accurate and ethical record of history. If we're going to do research on samurai culture, that has to be our primary driving force. Ethical, responsible work, research that provides an accurate, ethical, responsible record of the history. So in other words, when you do samurai research, it should be for no other reason than to create an accurate historical record. That needs to be your primary motivation. The next section is responsibility, or the responsible section. So I'll read that and we'll go over it. Responsible. That the work does not contain gross misrepresentations. That the work falls within reasonable standards, not just of Cerrsc, but of the discipline in which the authors of the work have produced the work. That the authors have taken the welfare of the invested samurai descendants potentially involved and made effort that the work does not disempower them, nor does it provide supremacy of the topic to non-samurai descendants. That the work is reasonably free of agenda other than to produce an accurate and ethical record. That the work not fail to clearly source its material. That the work not fail to contain some measure of examination of source material, providing analysis of the material as needed, especially in potentially problematic or controversial material. That the work contain cross-examination and cross-referencing of the material to provide a proper measure of investigation in the context of the material. So you'll see the ethics and the responsible mirror each other. And I'll explain, and some of you may say, that sounded like the same thing. Well, let me explain the subtle differences. First off, ethical begins with that the work does not contain outright fabrications. Responsible begins with that the work does not contain gross misrepresentation. So in the ethical category, it is that it does not contain lies, like fabrications, meaning there is nothing in the historical record that says this, you made it up, you purely made it up. In the responsible section, that covers misrepresentations. That means you quoted something from a text, but you misquoted it. Or you quoted it and you twisted the meaning so hard that it is now a misrepresentation. So if you make something up completely, that's unethical. If you misquote or poorly quote something, That is irresponsible. The work falls within reasonable, this is an important one too, that the work falls within reasonable standards, not just of Cerrsc, but of the discipline in which the authors of the work have produced the work. In other words, if you're a historian, not only do you have to follow Cerrsc, but you have to follow the standards of historians. If you're an anthropologist, you follow Cerrsc, but you also follow the rules and regulations and morals of anthropology, etc., etc., etc. You have, in other words, if you're a professional in your field, of course, you have to follow the rules of your field. And again, that the authors have taken the welfare of the invested samurai descendants and made an effort that the work does not disempower them, etc., etc. The ethical aspect of that is more the intent, and the responsible is the behavior. So the intent is in the ethical, and then the behavior is in the responsible. In other words, ethical would be the intent of the book and what you've really written in the book, and then responsible is how you've presented and interpreted and shown the data. So one is the intent, one is the action. The work is reasonably free of agenda, and we'll go into that a little bit more. There's a clause here. Your work does not have to be completely free of agenda, reasonably free, and reasonably free, you'll see later, refers to clear demarcation. We'll get to that shortly. The work does not fail to clearly source its material. There's no way around that. If you're going to write an ethical and responsible piece or a video, make an ethical video, you have to cite your data. You can't just say some samurai manual says such and such. You need to say what manual. Now I understand, we all understand, those of us who do this research know that perfect citation is very difficult for old samurai manuals. There's no page numbers, there's no publisher, obviously, okay. Even when books are published, when they're woodblock print, it's still very difficult to cite even woodblock prints. So that's understood. But you would still at least put the name of the text. And if the text is traditionally broken into like 3 volumes, you could say such and such text, volume 2, right? You have to make the good effort. Due diligence is the key words here. Due diligence to properly cite as best as possible as you can where you got the data from. The work not fail to contain some measure of examination of the source material, providing analysis as needed, especially in potentially problematic or controversial material. This is critical here because it's ethical, of course, it's ethical to use a historical text, but to be responsible, you need to analyze that text. You need to understand the context of the text and the history surrounding the text. It is irresponsible to simply just quote a text without having analyzed the text first. This is critical. There's a lot of people doing amateur research who are quoting fictional stories because they found a book. They didn't analyze the book. They didn't research the book. They didn't try to learn what is this book. They just quoted it, and it turns out that it's actually a book of fiction. It's a book of stories. So this is, and while storybooks do have definite anthropological and historical value, they don't have the value for being a historical fact. Do you see what I'm saying? It's very critical that, in other words, stories are good for analyzing the culture and the socio-ideology of the people, but you can't quote a historical event from a story, right? But and this happens a lot because people don't analyze the text, or it's a history book, but it's written 200 years after the event that it's recording, but people fail to analyze that and they take it at face value. They don't say, okay, well, this book was written 200 years after the event, so therefore this is the history recorded 200 years later. They say this is definitely what happened because it's in the book, but they fail to analyze and take into account the fact the book's written 200 years later. That is irresponsible. Also, if a work is problematic or controversial, there may be a history book written about a topic that is very controversial because its record of the topic is dramatically different from all the other records of the topic. That's fine as long as you study and analyze it. And then when you are discussing it, you are very clear to your audience that this book doesn't jive with the rest of the recorded history. It's okay to use the book, but you have to be responsible about how you use the book. And of course, the work should cross examine and cross reference other material because, in other words, you have to have a proper investigation of the material. You just cannot use a manual just because it exists. You have to cross reference and investigate that manual and that material to responsibly use it. It's ethical to use a historical manual, but it is irresponsible to use one without knowing the story and the context and having not investigated the manual. So now we're going to move on to the next part. So this is where we discuss a little bit about the difference between text being able, your work can have some agenda as long as it's demarcated. Regarding works produced by political or religious groups, that if the work is produced by a political or religious agency, the work must clearly demarcate the ethical responsible portions and the political religious statements. If the demarcation is clear and coherent, the work portions not related to political or religious agenda can be determined to be responsible. Those portions must be ethical as well. The portions which are political or religious statements cannot be found to be in accordance with Cerrsc guidelines. Simply put, if you produce a work that is coming from your group or you and it has a religious or political or religious function, that's fine as long as you clearly demarcate, clearly distinguish and label what is accurate historical samurai culture, history, that is ethical and responsible based on the guidelines given, and your political ideology or your religious ideology. Clearly demarcate the two. So you can say you can put out a piece that says, I believe such and such. Now I have this historically accurate history here. That's the history, and it's ethical and responsible. From that, I have this political ideology, or I have this religious belief. So the religious belief or the political ideology Cerrsc doesn't apply to it because it's your belief. It's belief. It's not academic, or it's not history, it's not work, it's belief. Off it goes. You can have it, but it can never fall under Cerrsc. The historical claims that you have, this is history, that falls under Cerrsc. That has to be ethical and responsible. So now we reach the closing of the main body, which says, thus, to protect the historical record for future generations and to honor the past generations, we in the present must agree to abide by the guidelines and provisions set forth in this Cerrsc. The risk of irresponsible and unethical works is too great to turn a deaf ear and a blind eye, as the very memory of the figures and events we hold in awe is at stake. To honor their memory and to preserve it for future generations, so that the truth of what really took place may endure, we agree to abide by and hold these Cerrsc guidelines as a measure to protect against the destruction of a history we hold most sacred. And I think that pretty much speaks for itself. Those of us that actually care about samurai history for whatever reason, we need to make sure that unethical and irresponsible behavior does not wreck that history. So that's the main body. This charter, along with these appendices, will be presented to many, 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 many people. It's been put on the internet for everybody to look at and read, but it's going to very key people, lots of different people, and it will hopefully, in my opinion, hopefully, it'll get support and approval from those individuals, and it will over time become this sort of network guideline for those of us who do samurai research and have investment in samurai culture and research and history. Will sort of understand that we abide by these rules. And even if the Cerrsc doesn't become the de facto sort of guidelines, it will still change the way that it'll change the paradigm of how this works. That's the goal, of course, is that it's not just the academics who are try to be ethical and responsible, but everybody will understand the value of ethical and responsible research and will follow, if not Cercsc specifically, the general the spirit of Cercsc, so to speak. So let's go over the appendices. Appendix I basically is just an abstract of the Cercsc, so I'll read it real quick. The Cercsc exists to provide a unified and agreed upon set of principles and guidelines for research into samurai culture. Samurai culture and history is the subject of many authors, and the field has been strengthened by many ethical and responsible works. However, the field has also been damaged and compromised by many unethical and irresponsible works as well. The purpose of Cercsc is to produce an industry standard guideline in which various works can be measured. Cercsc serves as a universal measure for invested individuals to refer to when a questionable work has been released into the public sphere. Cercsc is not intended to legitimate nor criticize any particular group, but rather to assess the level of authenticity and accuracy of the material any author puts forth as a historical fact. So, as stated in the charter, theories and beliefs are not under the provision of Cercsc. But if an organization publishes its beliefs and theories as historical facts, then those claims are subject to the Cercsc's provision. So again here, clear demarcation of belief and theory from fact. If an organization says we have a theory, we have a belief, that's fine. But if they say this is fact, then Cercsc would come into effect. All right, Appendix II is a basic checklist. And I'm not going to go over the entire checklist, but I'm just going to briefly cover it. So, point 1, does the work fall within the standard of the discipline of the author? That's basically what we're saying. If they're a historian, they should follow historian guidelines. If they're an anthropologist, they should follow anthropological guidelines, etc., etc. Point 2, does the work clearly demarcate well-sorted history from theory? Again, theory is fine as long as it's demarcated from the actual historical fact. Point 3, has the theory been grounded in ethical and responsible work? If the work contains a theory, has that theory been properly vetted against ethical and responsible work? The measure is important because if the theory is controversial, if the theory is controversial, does the theory have any proof? Has the theory been tested against ethical and responsible historical work? Point 4, does the work contain outright lies? This is critical. If the book contains outright fabrications, that is a massive problem. Number 5, does the work seek to legitimize a person or group? Again, a work is allowable so long as the agenda and theories are clearly demarcated from historical fact. If you don't, now someone may say, but I thought under ethics you said it can't exist for the purpose of legitimating. The historical can't exist so the way you interpret this is the historical facts can't exist in the legitimation process. If they clearly demarcate the legitimation and the theory and the belief from the historical fact, then Cercsc can look at just the historical fact and judge the historical fact as being ethical or responsible. But if the group fails to demarcate them, then the entire work has to be thrown out. That's the ethical part of it can't exist to legitimate. But if it's responsible and it clearly demarcates, then Cercsc can look at the historical part and just sort of ignore the belief part. Number 6, does the work seem to disempower invested samurai descendants or seek supremacy over invested samurai descendants? So if so, then the work is generally seen as unethical and irresponsible. It is a standard ethic of academic disciplines for one research to not cause harm to the research subjects. Simply put, invested samurai descendants are the present incarnation of the social group being studied. Ethical and responsible samurai research cannot harm, disempower, nor seek supremacy over them. Again, I explained that earlier. 7, has the work cross-referenced other accepted works? Generally speaking, it's required that a work cross-reference and compare and contrast itself to other accepted works regarding the subject material. This is crucial because it allows for greater context and it also allows for correction of potential errors in the work. You might have errors in your work that you could have sorted had you cross-referenced it and talked to other responsible researchers. Number 8, Has the work sufficiently cross-referenced contextual material? In other words, again, so number 7 is cross is working with other researchers now, but number 8 in this guideline of Appendix 2 is that work sufficiently cross-references the historical material. So a work in a particular subject should not be based on a single document or a single source alone. The author should gather large amounts of contextual sources to compare and contrast and reference the source material. Why this may be limited in some situations, most topics in the historical record have a fair amount of cross-reference material. In other words, even if you're studying some very small, unknown samurai manual, you should still cross-reference it. So if the samurai manual comes from the Murakami family, you should then find other materials from the other families that are also employed in the same domain. You should look at, there's so much contextual data that you need to look at. You can't just look at the single document by itself. That is irresponsible. Number 9, does the work contain gross overgeneralizations? Okay, so earlier we said, does it contain, in Appendix 2, number 4, did it contain outright lies? That's the unethical part. Appendix 2, number 9, does the work contain gross overgeneralizations? That's the irresponsible part. A work that contains gross overgeneralizations cannot be considered responsible. Gross overgeneralizations produce inaccurate and potentially damaging works. Damaging to who? Damaging to the history itself, damaging to future generations. Number 10, does the work contain cross-disciplinary efforts? Most works will require translation and analysis. It is highly recommended that a multidisciplinary approach is utilized. While the authors may already be composed of backgrounds from the disciplines required to produce the work, it is considered best practice to seek outside input from others who are from those specific fields as an ethical measure. In other words, you need to get the input from other ethical and responsible researchers. Now, if you have a team of people and one person is super fluent in Japanese and one person is an anthropologist and one person is a historian and one person is this and one person is that, then you would work in your team, but you should still seek outside input. It's always good to get some measure of other research individuals or teams to make sure that your team or yourself is on point. Now, point 11, has the work been reviewed with other ethical and responsible authors? So basically, while the entire work is not, Cerrsc does not expect the author to have their entire work reviewed by other researchers or authors, right? But as an ethical or responsible measure, key portions of the work should be presented to other researchers for review and for input, right? So, for example, in the academic world, generally speaking, you need to have your work peer-reviewed. And Cerrsc finds favor in peer-reviewed work, of course, but Cerrsc understands that ethical and responsible authors can exist outside of academia. So it's not going to require a full academic peer review. The spirit of this provision is to make sure that works are written within the context of the ongoing ethical and responsible research, and that researchers are not isolated and removed from the current body of investigation. Isolated projects have a great potential to violate the provisions of ethics and responsibility, right? So the intention of this provision is to guard and to prevent against such things happening. All right, in point 12 in Appendix 2, are the beliefs and traditions of an organization subject to Cerrsc? Simply put, no. And you can read it here in the PDF. Basically, it boils back down to clear demarcation, right? If an organization publishes a statement as "it is our belief" or "our tradition says," that claim is a belief of the organization. It's not subject to Cerrsc. Statements only become subject to Cerrsc if the organization claims the belief to be a historical fact. So they can say, we have the belief, we have the tradition that such and such happens, that such and such takes place, such and such took place, right? We have this belief that our school goes back to so and so. We have this belief that the founder of the tradition is so and so. That's fine. Yeah, that's fine. That because that is a belief. That is a tradition of the organization. But if that organization comes out and says, it is a historical fact that so and so lived at such and such time and did such and such, that then becomes subject to Cerrsc because that is a claim of historical fact. That can be measured under the ethic and responsible guidelines. So we have a new term here, which is introduced in Appendix 2.13, and it's also defined in the Appendix 5, which is the definitions. So that term is internal traditions. So the definition of internal tradition is belief, tradition, ritual, custom held by an organization that holds value and meaning to the members of the organization. This is equivalent to political/religious beliefs that is not subject to Cerrsc. The only conflict occurs when a belief is held to be a historical fact but cannot be verified nor supported by the historical record. So, Appendix 2.13, what is the role of internal traditions in Cerrsc? This is a continuation of point 12. Internal traditions do not fall within Cerrsc so long as the contents of the tradition are not held to be historical fact. In other words, they're held as a belief, they're held as tradition, but they're not being held out as historical fact. That's a very clear difference. If the contents of the tradition are held to be fact, then the historical authenticity of the tradition must be assessed. If the tradition is found to have no validity, then the organization may retract their claim of historical fact and continue to believe and hold it as an internal tradition. However, future claims of the belief's historical accuracy would have to be ruled as unethical and irresponsible. So say that somebody says, oh, I'm part of this religious organization and it was founded by this person who was at this place at this time and did this thing. And they say this is historical fact. Okay, that's fine. Is there any evidence of that? If there's no evidence of that, all we can say is, okay, that's your belief. But we can't say that it's historical fact because there's literally nothing to support it. And that becomes this is how it becomes ethical and responsible. Now, if that organization were to continue to push that they believe that such and such is a historical fact, but there's no grounding for it, there's no proof or evidence of it, and they're trying to rewrite history opposed to the responsible and ethical history, we have no choice but to say that's unethical. So again, it's fine for people it's okay, it's totally awesome, it's fine that people have a tradition to have their belief, and but we cannot say that it is a historical truth unless they can provide some measure. And not even then, just anybody. If anybody can find historical evidence to support the claim of the belief, then it falls under Cerrsc. So again, long story short, belief and internal tradition does not fall under Cerrsc. It only falls under Cerrsc when it is claimed to be historical fact. Appendix 3 of the Charter goes into the role of organizations with internal traditions. So this goes in even deeper. So I'm not going to go over it again, but this you should read this because this goes into more depth. There's more. This is your guideline. This is the explanation of how this works, how this actually breaks down even further. For example, 4 points to come up in here. Point 1, does your organization have the support of any invested samurai descendants involved in the topic? 2, does your organization practice ethical and responsible research of samurai history? 3, does your organization participate with other ethical and responsible researchers in effort to maintain an accurate and cohesive historical body of knowledge regarding samurai culture. 4. Has your organization invested resources into projects other than your own organization? These things, and then and read that fourth appendix. It goes through and explains this in more detail, breaks it down better. So Appendix 3. Yes, Appendix 3 is the appendix that talks about internal traditions and it breaks it down more. Appendix 4 talks about, is it possible for a historical finding done through ethical and responsible research to cause harm to an invested samurai descendant? If so, how is it properly handled? And this appendix goes through and explains that yes, it is possible for harm to take place, and it's up to the researcher to mitigate the harm as much as possible within the context of maintaining the accurate historical data. Because it's very possible that an invested samurai family says that such and such is true, and upon extensive ethical and responsible research, you find that there is either no evidence to support that, or you find evidence contrary to that. What do you do then? And this gives some guideline for that. So essentially, the provision for not doing harm nor seeking to disempower the family refers to the focus and the intention of the published piece. Right? So if the author has made every measure to avoid purposeful and intentional harm and disempowerment, then the author is not in violation of the provision, so long as the damaging historical fact was found through ethical and responsible research and was presented ethically and responsibly when published. So Appendix 4 has the example of ethical and responsible would simply publishing the fact within the proper context. No mention is made of the invested samurai descendant. No measure is taken to direct the damage to them. So for example, if you just say, this is a following list of Takeda Shingen's archery captains, right? So the following is a list of Takeda Shingen's archery captains, and you just list the captains. That is ethical and responsible. To be unethical and irresponsible would be to publish the fact and deliberately direct the damaging focus towards that person. So for example, if you said, the following is a list of Takeda Shingen's archery captains, of which Mr. X's alleged ancestor is not found. The absence of Mr. X's alleged ancestor calls into question Mr. X's family history. That would be unethical and irresponsible. So hopefully you guys can clearly see the difference. In the first one, you printed a list of the Takeda archery captains. You know that Mr. X claims his ancestor is there, and you know his ancestor is not on the list, but you don't point that out. You just put the data. You simply put the data. Here's Takeda Shingen's archery captains. Done. If you go out of your way, like if you make an effort to point out that something is amiss, then that's when it becomes unethical and irresponsible. Appendix 5 is just further definitions. Basically, some of the key words from the charter are found in Appendix 5. So that is the preliminary version of the charter. Again, the charter is going to be spread and taken to different people. Hopefully the charter picks up speed and picks up support, and the charter becomes a guideline that everybody who's seriously invested and interested in samurai culture, the research of it, will agree to, if not follow the charter itself, agree to follow a similar approach. We're not looking for everybody to follow the charter specifically, but to follow the spirit of the charter, the guidelines, the ideas of the charter. So, guys, read the charter. Let's get some feedback. What do you think? Do you have what is your input on the charter? What is your thoughts, feelings? And the other thing is, if the charter for the ethical and responsible research of samurai culture gains enough strength, then a society for the ethical and responsible research of samurai culture would be started, and then that society would basically seek to put out a journal Once every 6 months, it would put out a journal that would have publications from anybody following the guidelines, and that could be uh, people from Japanese. Well, I'm in America, so Japanese American societies, professors, graduate students, hell, even undergraduate students, independent researchers, researchers that are part of other projects. You can be Westerners, you can be Asian, as long as your work follows the Cerrsc guidelines, you could get into the journal and would be released once every 6 months. And that it could be uh, an abstract. It doesn't even have to be a full article. It could just be an abstract of your work. You know, this is my name. This is what I work on. Here's an abstract of what I'm working on. Da 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 da. Or you could put an actual. You could put a small article of 1 page, or you could do a 6 page art. But it would be, the point is we're trying to network and create a a network. I just said networking. To create a network is kind of redundant, but to create a network of ethical and responsible samurai researchers from various backgrounds. We're not looking for just academics, or we're not looking for just independent historians. We're looking for everybody who does samurai research in any fashion, whether you are a martial arts teacher, whether you are an independent historian, whether you're a historian attached to a university, whether you're an anthropologist, whether you're an archaeologist, whether you're a filmmaker, whether you are just an interested book writer, whether you are a member of some kind of historical society, whether you're a member of a Japanese American society, or a Japanese, wherever you are, fill in the blank country society. The idea would be that there would be this network of, we we value, we hold samurai history as a valuable and sacred thing, and we want to make sure that it's done ethically and responsibly. And so therefore we have networked to this modus operandi. That is the goal, that is the intention. So read over it and tell me what you guys think. Again, this is the preliminary version, subject to minor changes, but for the most part, it'll change and shift some, but for the most part, this is it.